Great. Thank you so much, Janelle, and thanks to all of you for sticking out to this very last presentation of the first day. There's been so much rich information. I hope you can absorb this next 15 minutes or so. I'd like also to thank Emory for the opportunity to be here, as well as my co-author, Charlie Shackleton, who is not here, but we worked very closely on this study. So I will be speaking about a study that I carried out with Charlie slightly before the pandemic, where we really looked at a broad range of literature around traditional vegetables in Africa to try to capture more of a framework and a definition and a way forward on how to promote and use and study these foods. So as we all know, and as we've heard about from the previous presentations, sub-Saharan Africa is no different in the sense that there are over 1,000 different vegetables that are considered neglected and underutilized, not by the populations eating them, but by us as researchers and by the broader policymakers, development practitioners, conservationists that are trying to really to promote better livelihoods around most of the countries across Africa. The populations that are using them really rely on them for a wide range of services and roles. One being their daily dietary, vitamin and mineral intake, their livelihoods, whether it's an urban or rural population, as well as their cultural identity and their pride as Africans. Where we start to run into an issue is that there's a lot of confusion around the terms and the concepts. They're often used interchangeably. So terms such as indigenous, traditional, wild, even vegetable are all thrown around and used simultaneously, even though they have very different meanings. Secondly, the word indigenous, which really means that it's from that place, has been used to describe a lot of these foods such as cassava or moringa, which very much did not come from Africa. Even the term vegetable complicates this conversation because fruits that come from species such as African eggplant or okra are often lumped together in this broader group of vegetables. And this isn't just an awkward dance of words and semantics. It also creates real challenges for researchers as well as policymakers and conservationists that really want to optimize the use of these plants. So what we set out to do was fourfold. First, we wanted to provide an overview of the definitions and the terms that are used in the literature. Secondly, to propose a definition for the term traditional African vegetable. Third, to create a typology to actually classify some of the broader groups. And lastly, to identify trends and gaps for further research and extension. How we did that was to carry out a literature search related to African vegetables in, as I mentioned, slightly before the pandemic in November 2018 in Scopus. We used the keywords African plus indigenous vegetable, African plus traditional vegetable, and African plus leafy vegetable. We focused our geographic scope on sub-Saharan Africa and included relevant articles related to African diaspora populations only in English. And we looked at publications from just short of a 20-year range. So the year 2000 to the end of 2018. What we ended up with was a list of initially 316 articles, the majority of which used the term African leafy vegetable. We then had to pull a number of those out based on they were not focused on the topic or they weren't in English. There were a few repeated articles and some of them we weren't even able to access. So we ended up with 121 articles in total. And I should note that it wasn't our intent to do a full systematic review of every single publication that was out there, even in that 18-year span. We really approached it as more of a practical way to try to begin this conversation and to put some parameters around how these words are used. We then analyzed those 121 articles by looking at the journal, publication year, country, terms used, definition, species, aim of study, and the methodological approach. We then assessed all of those terms for patterns over time across the different African regions. What we found was a number of things. First of all, the number of publications really started to skyrocket around 2015. They started in, as I mentioned, the study started in 2000, it ended in 2018, and I imagine that this trend line has continued to go up. We also looked at the percentage of publications by country, and there's only 100 articles that are mentioned here because we did include, as I mentioned, some articles of African diaspora populations, but we took those out for this graph. The largest percent of the publications came from South Africa, followed by Kenya, Nigeria, and then there was a cluster, Tanzania, Benin, and Ghana, and then the rest of the countries came in with a smaller number of publications. As I mentioned, we also looked at the main methods that were used in these publications. The vast majority of them, just under 40%, were laboratory tests, and that includes things such as looking at nutritional properties or medicinal properties. The next biggest group was mixed, so it used a variety of approaches, followed by growth trials, so more agricultural approaches, looking at fertilizer rates, et cetera, quantitative review, and then other. We then wanted to understand a little bit the plants. What are the plants that are being studied and that are being published? We found that the genera that came up the most often were Solanum, Amaranthus, and it's interesting to hear that we did already hear about Amaranth earlier in the day, so nice to hear that it's coming back in a different way, in a different place. And then Cleome, and I should note that Cleome gynandra was the top species that was studied across all the publications. This is a giant list and it's hard to read, and it's also hard to, and that's kind of the point, is that there are, out of the 121 articles, there were 76 different terms that authors used to describe this, again, this concept of indigenous African vegetables or traditional vegetables. And I really appreciate some authors really just tried to cram them all in one. Indigenous and underutilized South African traditional leafy vegetables, just hit every single word, or things like wild growing African dark leafy vegetables. I love all those descriptors, but it really makes it a challenge. I highlighted the ones that really rose to the top, and that's also, it justifies a little bit the terms that we searched on, but things such as indigenous vegetables, indigenous leafy vegetables, and African leafy vegetables were the ones that really rose to the top. We also looked at how these terms were used across time. So starting out, most of the publications use the term traditional leafy vegetable. Around 2007, we started to see some of these other terms coming in. They all more or less flatlined towards the end of the publications that we looked at, except for leafy vegetable, which really skyrocketed. We also looked at how the terms were used across the different regions in Africa. And again, this is kind of a similar story where, at least for East Africa, West Africa, and Southern Africa, really all the terms were used. Central Africa stands out a little bit because the publications only included the terms leafy vegetable, indigenous leafy vegetable, and African indigenous vegetable. That may be a little bit a reflection of language, since we only focus on English publications. Likely a lot of the French research that's out there, just we're not capturing how these terms are really being used. Nevertheless, in East Africa, there was a slight preference for the term African indigenous vegetable. West Africa, slight preference for leafy vegetable, and Southern Africa, a slight preference for African leafy vegetable. We also ended up with this giant table of all of the attributes, this huge range that African vegetables can really vary, whether it's the origin, some of them are introduced, have been naturalized, indigenous, to whether or not they're really specialized groups that have knowledge about them, or it's limited to subsets, or if it's more widespread. And this huge range of attributes likely has to do with the fact that sub-Saharan Africa includes as many as 2,000 different linguistic groups, 54 different countries, 1.3 billion people. So of course, there's this huge range in how these plants are used, as well as the information that we know about them as researchers. Similarly, and again, this is supposed to be kind of mind-boggling, but we also looked out of all of the 121 articles, how many actually had a definition for any of these terms, and only 19 of them did. And only, I think there were 4 studies that used the same author supposedly, but they all paraphrased the definition slightly different. So again, this really just accentuates how much of a, I don't want to say mess, because this is really rich material, but how difficult it really is to capture this concept. So what we've done, and to kind of usher us into hopefully the future, is number one, to propose a consolidated definition. So we landed on the term traditional African vegetables because given that broad range of attributes that they have, really the only thing in common is that they're used in traditional cuisine. So we chose traditional African vegetables as the broader term, and we defined it as plant species that are indigenous or naturalized to Africa, well adapted to or selected for local conditions, whose plant parts are used as a vegetable, and whose modes of cultivation, collection, preparation, and consumption are deeply embedded in local cuisine, culture, folklore, and language. And we came up with this definition based on the attribute table, so tried to pull all of those key features in, as well as the really salient features from that long definition list. We also proposed this categorization scheme, which ends up with 4 subcategories of traditional African vegetables. So if you start from the broader umbrella of vegetables, you can then break that into, and again, this could apply just about anywhere in the world, but we're just focusing on that top line that's highlighted in kind of that gray color for traditional African vegetables. So you start with vegetables, and then you can divide them into indigenous, naturalized vegetables versus the more conventional kind of global ones. From there, you can break it into regions. So we focus on traditional African vegetables. From there, we divided it into how the plants are propagated, whether they're largely self-propagated or wild, or they're cultivated by humans. And lastly, we divided them into what plant part was consumed, whether it's leafy or non-leafy, ending up with these 4 acronyms. So SL stands for a self-propagated leafy traditional African vegetable. SN is self-propagated non-leafy, etc. And this, the logic behind this helps to reduce the number of synonyms that are out there, excuse me, as well as creates a more coordinated path forward, as well as really just, again, tries to capture and to put this in a more organized way. We also propose what we are calling the systems approach, where, as we heard in the earlier presentation, there's a lot of drivers of change that are putting pressure on these traditional food systems. And in order to do all we can as researchers or as practitioners or conservationists, we need to kind of get out of our silos and think about these foods in a more systematic way. So we have divided the main 3 areas into actors and institutions, environment and production systems, and practices, traditions, cultural, and folklore. And with those 3 research domains, we also have a number of core research questions that we, through the research, have really identified as some of the main questions we need to be asking moving forward. And it's to say that these questions need to be asked within the domains as well as across the domains. I did want to point out a few limitations. As I mentioned earlier, our study was not a full systematic review. We ended up looking at 112 articles. There's much more out there, and we could have done a much broader search, but we did not. We also focused only on English, and as you've seen, that was complicated enough. And certainly this needs to be done, including the broad range of research that's out there in other languages, particularly French coming from West and Central Africa. So in conclusion, our analysis identified that there's a clear interest and a clear increase in research related to traditional African vegetables, but the current use of the terms and the definitions shows that there's so much redundancy and lack of uniform use that really limits the ability to formulate conservation and development policies. Therefore, if you're proposing this one all-encompassing definition of traditional African vegetables as a way forward, as well as this accompanying typology that helps to differentiate a little bit the subgroups within that, we propose not only a unified way forward, but also a more holistic and interdisciplinary systems approach to furthering research and practical management of these vegetables. If you want to read more, as well as look at all the articles that we looked at, this was published in a special issue of Economic Botany on the topic of African traditional vegetables. So please do check it out, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I had my back to the crowd, so I didn't see any hands up. Great, thanks.
So when you went through and took out all the vegetables that weren't really vegetables, did okra make the cut, or is it really a fruit? That's my favorite one.
Again, I mean, it's how the local communities are using them. And so it does make the cut, so to speak, because it's used as a vegetable. And Yes, so the short answer is yes.
What is the difference then between a vegetable and a fruit?
Well, in our definition, we define traditional African vegetables are those that are used as a vegetable. So more in how it is prepared and consumed. I mean, botanically, it's one thing, but I think the use is something very different. One is salty and the other is sweet. I like that as well.
The definition. Well, I think people are starting to trickle in for the next talk, but thank you so much,
Right.
Alexandra. That was great.